Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Elinor DeWire. Elinor is a researcher, photographer, and writer about lighthouses, and she has been immersed in this genre since 1972. She has visited more than 800 sentinels in the United States, Canada, the Caribbean, Europe, New Zealand, and Australia. Elinor is the author of over 20 books and more than 250 articles on the subject of lighthouses. And former Coast Guard historian Dr. Robert Scheina calls Elinor America's most prolific lighthouse author and a driving force behind the recent upsurge in interest in preserving lighthouses and the history and nostalgia surrounding them. Elinor, it is a pleasure to have you on the Success Insight podcast today.
Oh, thank you, Howard. I'm happy to be here.
Elinor, I have to admit, this topic and knowing that I was going to be interviewing you and doing the research, you have, in this year of the rat, because I was just picking my car up I live right near Chinatown in Chicago, and they had the calendar there. And I was reminded in the year of the rat, which is every 12 years, it's going to be my birthday this year. And I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I want to tell you, you have succeeded in bringing back a little bit of some wonderful memories from my childhood. So right off the bat, I want to say thank you.
Well, that's great. You know, I hear that a lot, Howard, because people remember going to the beach and having vacations there, seeing lighthouses, and it's a wonderful memory for them. So when they grow up, I hope they come and visit lighthouses and learn more about them.
Fantastic. And I just realized as I was reading the show notes, and you've been working on lighthouses since 1972. That was another year of the rat. And so now if somebody wants to do the math, they have officially dated me. That's okay. I can live with that. How did you get started in researching lighthouses? What was the insight, that light bulb that went off and said, wow?
Well, I've always been interested in everything and anything, even as a kid. And I married a Navy officer. And of course, the first thing he did was move me to his base assignment in Brunswick, Maine. Maine has about 70 lighthouses, and we had no money, so we'd jump in our Volkswagen and go out to the shore and look for beach glass and shells and so forth. And very early in our life together, we did that. And I looked out, and there was this white spike sticking up on an island offshore, and it was flashing. And suddenly I realized what it was, and it just grabbed my imagination. It was so fascinating to think that somebody was living out there, taking care of that lighthouse so that the shipping and boating public would be safe, and living on an island too. So I immediately started reading books. My husband would bring home books from the base library. We'd go to the town library, and it just became a total fascination when I found out that they were all over. And they're even inland. I've seen a number of inland lighthouses on rivers and lakes. So everybody needs a passion in life, Howard, and I guess this is what grabbed me. I just really began collecting things and information and had scrapbooks. And then once my two kids got into school and all my housework was done by 9 a.m., I needed something to do. So I started writing about my favorite subject, and that's what launched my writing career as well.
That is unbelievable. And for our listeners and for me as well, can you explain what is a lighthouse? What is its purpose? And historically, is there a reference somewhere that perhaps you've come across of one of the earliest descriptions of a lighthouse? I'm curious there.
Yes, there is. A lot of people argue about the definition of lighthouse. There's this whole cult of people who love lighthouses, who visit them, read about them, take pictures of them, collect stuff. And they go back and forth. You have some people who will take a picture of a light on a fiberglass pole and say that's a lighthouse. But to me, when you say the word lighthouse, it reflects that it has a home. Somebody lives there. Somebody takes care of it. And we're seeing that less and less today as lighthouses are becoming automated. But most of them are old, and they were built to have some sort of structure on which light is added, an optic of sorts, and somebody is there, the keeper, to make sure that's lit, to either warn mariners away from some danger or give them a landfall if they're headed for a river or a bay. So it's a warning and a welcome kind of thing. But for me, I think if it's a lighthouse, you need to have the tower, and at some point in its career, it needed to have a keeper.
Excellent. And, you've alluded to the introduction of modern technology is the lightkeeper, which I know there have been books, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, perhaps movies, and I mean some very famous movies have been shot in and around lighthouses, suspense, comedy, horror, etc. And there's just so much history, and in some ways I think they're almost taken for granted. They're there; it's a part of the imagery and the mystique of the story. And I'm wondering is people just don't appreciate what they're there for and their importance in civilization, of being able to travel from one destination to another and port to port. And do you find that are we losing sight of what they were there for and what their importance was, or do we take them for granted? What do you think?
Well, I think we were for a while. They belonged to their own government entity many years ago. It's called the U.S. Lighthouse Service, and it was actually kind of like a branch of the military. The lighthouse keepers wore uniforms, they were inspected, they had ranks. So it was quasi-military, but it was its own agency in the government. And then as technology got more advanced with optics, and we got things like radar and LORAN and so forth, the need to have a lighthouse keeper really began to disappear. We really didn't need those guys and gals anymore. And then the Coast Guard took over lighthouses in 1939, which was very difficult for them, I believe. They have their own mission of search and rescue, and now they've got Homeland Security, which is huge. And they really didn't have the time or the passion to take care of these structures. Right. And slowly the old lighthouse keepers retired and died away. And we went through this period where lighthouses were torn down, they were sold, they became ice cream parlors, they became hamburger stands, somebody's cottage, all sorts of uses that to me ruined the integrity of the structures. They weren't meant for those jobs. And then we got the Heritage Acts coming along in the 60s, and suddenly people said, oh my gosh, these are historic structures. What are we doing? We can't let them deteriorate. We can't turn them into silly usage. And so a groundswell of interest began, and slowly it has grown and grown and grown. And people like me, of course, have perpetuated it by writing about lighthouses, talking about them. I spend a great deal of time interfacing with the public to continually raise the profile of lighthouses and send out the message that these are structures and a chapter in history that we don't want to lose. I go to schools and kids absolutely love lighthouses. Howard, the easiest thing to draw when you're in fourth grade is a lighthouse. It's just easy.
Sure, yes.
Yeah, and we make them out of paper cups. Older kids, we electrify them with a little battery and a tiny light, and they just love it. Who doesn't love lighthouses, and especially kids? So now that interest in taking care of these structures and appreciating them for what they've done for us over the years has returned. We don't need lighthouses. We absolutely don't. My husband, being a Navy officer, will tell you he's been at the helm of ships, and the dashboard there and all the men and the orders going out and the technology they use totally eclipses the need to have a visual signal. But he'll also say that looking off on the starboard side and suddenly seeing maybe Montauk Lighthouse shining and knowing what that is, it brings him a level of comfort that all of those instruments don't. So it's kind of a two-sided coin. We need them, but we don't need them. So many people now are saying, well, let's save them and let's put some of them back into service in places where it's tricky navigation and you might want to have that second thing to look at or hear the fog signal to make your way. So the big answer to your question is yes, people do care about lighthouses more and more. They're helping out. They're working, actually scraping paint and things like that. So we have these groups. Of course, I'm on the board of directors of the biggest one in the nation, which is the U.S. Lighthouse Society. We launched that in 1985. And then there have been all these splinter groups and chapters that have come along, and individual lighthouses often have a nonprofit group that looks after them. Because in the end, these structures were made to be taken care of. You know, the word lighthouse has the word house, which means somebody should live there and keep the windows clean and paint and all. So if you abandon them and take away the keepers, well, then vandalism and deterioration set in quickly. So I'm very thankful that there are groups that are taking care of their individual local lighthouses.
Just given the historical significance of lighthouses here in the U.S. and around the world, I can't think of a better place for resources, not only for the public safety and well-being, but also because of their historical significance. It's a landmark in and of itself, and I would imagine there are cities and locations around the world where that lighthouse is the landmark. Everybody knows about it. They set out to visit it, kind of like you did way back when you were with your husband and you first moved out east. You go off on a weekend trip, we're going to go visit this lighthouse, and there's just something about that mystique of it. And do you have a record or some anecdote of perhaps some of the earliest writing about a lighthouse? Now, whether that's here in the U.S. or perhaps in Europe or the Middle East, because I can imagine back in the times of the Phoenicians and the Greeks when they're traveling in their ships and going out of the Caribbean, et cetera, out into the Pacific, that lighthouse, whoever was staffing it, they were darn glad where that lighthouse was there, or else they were going to end up on the rocks somewhere. So close to home, but not quite making it because they were not aware of the actual the danger of their surroundings. But is there a lighthouse that you recall historically that is like, if you're going to go anywhere, you got to go see that lighthouse?
There is one historically that I wish I could go see. It's gone now. And it's the very first one of which we have record in the world. And it was one of the seven wonders of the world in ancient times. It was the great lighthouse of Alexandria, Egypt. Probably about 400 feet tall. It was a tiered structure as far as we know. We have drawings of it. We have descriptions of it from ancient writers. And recently, archaeological divers, have found pieces of it lying in the water in Alexandria, in the port there. And so that gives us a really good idea what it might have looked like and what the dimensions were. And, the Egyptians, they never built anything halfway. It was always grand and majestic, and this was. It was said to have a beacon that shone, probably 20 miles. Some historians exaggerate it to a much further range, but just the curvature of the Earth is going to kick in at some point. But we argue, we wonder, we research, we postulate about what kind of optic it had. there wasn't a lot of wood available in Egypt, so they wouldn't have had a fire of wood up there in the top of it. We didn't have modern lenses and things like that at the time. So what was it? I've read that the Egyptians crafted amazing marble mirrors. They would just shine a slab of marble until it behaved like a mirror, and then they put a fire basket in front of it, and that kind of intensified the light and made it show further. And the keepers, it did have keepers. They were probably priests, and this was a holy duty to take care of the lighthouse. Unfortunately, and the reason that we can't go see it, Howard, is an earthquake toppled it in about the 14th century. And then pieces of it were carried away into the sea. And then I suppose any of the valuable things about it were probably toted away as well. So,
of course. Yes.
Yeah. So we don't have it anymore. But we do have some ancient lighthouses. There's the remains of the lighthouse at Dover in England, which the Romans built when they invaded Britannia. There is the beautiful lighthouse at Genoa, Italy, which actually was kept by the uncle of Christopher Columbus. Kind of a neat bit of trivia there. And I like to think that young Christopher came, Cristoforo, as they called him, and visited his uncle and climbed up to the top and thought, I wonder what is over the horizon. I wonder what's out there. It might have inspired his interest in exploring and traveling the seas. So there are a few old ones around. And here in the United States, the oldest existing tower we have is at Sandy Hook, New Jersey. It was built in 1764. And that old girl is still shining. She's been through the world wars. During World War II, they painted her in camouflage so she wouldn't show up. And the thing about lighthouses during the war is their beams sweeping out over the sea would silhouette ships, and then enemy submarines would see those ships and could fire on them. So a lot of the lighthouses were turned off during the war, and then they were painted, some of them in these camouflage patterns, so that the enemy didn't see them and try to ruin them. Lots of interesting stuff about lighthouses during the war. I could go on and on.
Oh, no doubt. So I want to chat a little bit about your library of books. I mean, that you have, again, since 1972, been traveling all over the world. You've got the Pacific Coast. You've got the stories of lightkeepers, Florida. You've got activity books, which is perfect for kids, and just Alaska, Mid-Atlantic, everywhere. And how did you, I don't know how I can even begin to ask you. So tell me about your books, because they're all very unique. But do you have a method that when you're sitting down to write a story or write, historical references to these lighthouses, what has been your process for sitting down and saying, okay, there's a new book in me about lighthouses, and this is what it's going to be? How are you going through that process? Because you've got quite a few books. What's your process that you're going through in order to start to craft these books?
Well, early on, my first couple of books, in fact, I just sat down and said, I'm going to write them with my heart, with my soul, with all the things I know, and then I'm going to go out and see if somebody will publish. And I was very lucky. My first book was about the lighthouses of Florida. I was living there at the time. My husband was attached to the base at Orlando in the center of the state. And of course, we had gone to visit the lighthouses, and I went to a library one day and I asked the librarian, are there some books about Florida's lighthouses? And she, honest to God, Howard, looked at me and said, Florida has lighthouses? That's how much Disney and SeaWorld and sand and seashells and conchs had eclipsed the very structures that help to civilize and populate the state, because many of those lighthouses were there before Florida became part of the United States, and they were there for a reason. Florida is an extremely dangerous coast. You got all those reefs off the south part of it. It just kind of sticks out there in the water. So it ended up with 30-some lighthouses. But I was flabbergasted. She didn't know. And then she said, well, absolutely, I don't know of any books. about Florida lighthouses. And so I thought, I'll just write one. I had that kind of blind confidence as a young person. I guess I always have, I just think, I can do this.
Good for you.
And without any college degree at that time, I was in my 20s and I hadn't finished college. I'd started and hadn't finished. Without any journalism training or anything, I just sat down and wrote this book. And I based it on my travels to the lights and what I could glean and gather as I went. And the very first publisher I sent it to said, "Oh, what fun. We'll do this." And I thought, wait a minute, am I not supposed to get 40 or 50 rejection slips first? So, yeah, I was delighted. I don't know really how that happened. I'm a fairly sound writer. Think I do a good enough job. I won a scholarship in English in high school for my writing, so I knew I wasn't half bad at it. But yeah, and then they took the next book. I told them there's a whole story, a whole history of people who built these, designed them, built them, lived in them, now take care of them. We should capture that before it's gone. And that was Pineapple Press in Sarasota, Florida. And they have since closed up shop and sold their inventory to another publisher, Littlefield and Bowman. So I have a bunch of publishers. But, after you write a few articles and write a few books, people start coming to you. So many of these titles from about, 2000 on were just publishers contacting me and asking me, would you do a book on New England lighthouses? Would you do a book on the Pacific Coast and so on? And that's every writer's dream. They come to you. And so I'm very lucky. And I guess it's because this is my thing. This is what I know. I can't tell you where my car keys are right now, but ask me anything about lighthouses and I know what that's going to be. It wasn't the usual traditional way that the writers get into print, but it's how it happened for me. And as far as writing a book now, Howard, I have filing cabinets full of research after 40 years. I have a huge library of books in my office, and I have the computer, which I didn't have in the early 90s. And all writers know that the internet's a godsend.
Right. Well, I have to say, wherever your next book is coming from and the location is, I think there's definitely some more interviews that we need to do because, I just find this so fascinating. And I'm like, as I'm listening to you and you're sharing the story and the history, I'm thinking, here I am in Chicago. We have lighthouses out on the lake. There's one big one right on the water crib, which is the intake for where we get our water from Lake Michigan. And it used to be that it was staffed. Now I think people can, there's just somebody that lives on it. Maybe like one person lives on it. And I always thought I would love to visit it. So we have our lighthouses and I'm like, God, I live on the lake. I need to go travel and see some more lighthouses because, what a great way to get away for a weekend.
You can take the whole loop around the lake. Michigan has about 118 lighthouses, so you'll be busy for a while. Yeah.
Well, I just have to have a good car, gas, and some good books on tape along the way, and hopefully somebody to go with me.
And a camera.
So of course, the camera. Got to have the camera. So I'm curious, with your history of visiting these lighthouses, is there one or two stories that just kind of jump out at you, maybe because you had this oh wow moment, or maybe something just tugged at your heartstring, or and just like, oh, that was fantastic. Anything in the years you've been writing and visit about these lighthouses and visiting them, anything that really jumps out at you?
Oh, lots and lots of stories. I think that for me, it's the human story. It's the people. I love the structures, but apparently there's a quote going around by me that's something like lighthouses are not just brick and stone and glass and metal, but they're people. They're a story of what happened there. And so that to me is really the important part of it. When I first started doing this, I get screamed at for going on private property. A lot of people think that the tide line is theirs. It's not. That was hard for me. I would say I'm just taking a picture, or I'm just drawing the lighthouse, or I'm describing it and for research. That's all changed now. I get to go to any of them I want to, and the Coast Guard has been so generous taking me.
Good for you.
Yeah, but I guess hearing about rescues, that's something that's so poignant to me. A lighthouse keeper like Marcus Hanna, who was the keeper of the Cape Elizabeth Lighthouse in Maine, and he had a very bad cold one day. He came off his watch. His wife put him to bed. And just shortly after that, a ship wrecked right off the lighthouse, and it was winter. There was ice hanging from the masts on the ship. This was in the days of sail, so you can imagine this beautiful ice castle of a ship, yet men were dying. And this man got out of bed, put his uniform on, went out and got in his boat and helped the lifesavers. There was a life-saving station nearby. Helped them rescue. And rescuing is as dangerous as being shipwrecked, as far as I'm concerned, especially in conditions like he had there. He was awarded a life-saving medal for his work, and it must be great satisfaction for a job like that to come back in from the cold and get a hot cup of coffee and know that everybody on that ship has been rescued. They're not going to die. So I love those stories, absolutely. One that just really sticks with me, and I'll tell you about it very quickly here. I met a gentleman named Gino Campanero some years ago. I was researching the lighthouses of Alaska, and I had posted some articles and things online. And he got in touch with me and he said, I used to live at the Scotch Cap Lighthouse in Alaska as one of the keepers. There were 5 of us there, and it was a Coast Guard keeper. And he told me about the winters, how horrid they were. Scotch Cap is out at the end of the Aleutian Islands and just takes a beating. And eventually it was destroyed by a tsunami in 1946. But Gino was there during the war, and luckily wasn't there when the tsunami came, or he would have perished. But he said they had dogs on station, and the dogs were considered part of the crew. They did a lot of great things for the men. But one day Gino decided to take a hike. And as happens in that part of the world, a storm blew up just like that, a willowaw, as they call it, and it began snowing sideways, flakes the size of quarters, and Gino couldn't see which way to go. He got lost, he got disoriented, and then he began to get cold and colder and colder, and he had the 2 station dogs with him. They always went along for protection, and Gino said he got so lethargic that he laid down on the ground and thought, I'll just rest for a little while. Well, you and I know what was happening. He was hypothermic and falling asleep and about to die. And these 2 dogs would not have that. They began licking his face and jumping on him and rolling on him, and they made him get awake and get up, and he crawled on his hands and knees for about, a quarter of a mile. And suddenly he could see the light through the snowflakes and the blizzard. And these dogs just kept helping him, getting him there.
Oh my.
And he sent me a beautiful picture of him feeding the dogs with the lighthouse in the background, and there's snow everywhere, and he's a young man. And it just struck me, people don't realize how hard this job could be depending on where you lived. And his story, in fact, inspired me to write an entire book about animals that lived at lighthouses, because their story is just as vibrant and interesting as the human story. So, I've got dogs and cats and horses and, everything imaginable. Even the bugs that were drawn to the beacon at night. There's great, great stories. And birds. Birds collide with the tower. They get confused. They smash into the lighthouse and perish. Sometimes as they're migrating, an entire murmuration of them will come toward the lighthouse, and then they'll all just land on it. And it just looks very much like a Hitchcock movie when you see that.
Oh, my.
Yes. Yes.
So, well, Elinor, you and I have chatted a little bit before today's podcast. We love to put pictures up in our show notes on our main website. You've already shared a couple, and I don't know if one of the ones you shared was the one you just described with Gino at the Scotch Cap Lighthouse.
It is. You'll see him with his two dogs.
Oh, fantastic, because that's one of the ones we're going to use in our show notes, because that'll put a little bit deeper connection to the story. And I also want to acknowledge something, because it was in our preparation for today's show, is you have two books that won the Ben Franklin Award and the Coast Guard Book Award. And then the Coast Guard 13th District presented you with the Coast Guard Meritorious Public Service Award. And lo and behold, you're also an amateur astronomer. And a novelist. So you have made quite the career of the writing and this wonderful topic of lighthouses. And I tell you, like I said earlier, next to the lighthouse, which I remember visiting those around Michigan when my parents would take my sister and I out on vacation, but lighthouses next to the sound of the train whistle. There's something about a train whistle that always brings me back to my childhood. You have succeeded in really helping me reminisce about what it was like growing up. And now it's like...
Oh, thank you. I'm glad.
Yeah. And now I want to go visit some lighthouses. And so I actually want to know when you're going to be in the Midwest, because I want to meet up with you and go with you. And
have a guide. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to do that. Or, somewhere in the U.S. I mean, I fly Southwest a lot. I'm sure I could go somewhere where you're going to go visit. And just a wonderful career. And these lighthouses are so important for our safety, but they're beacons of hope. They are part of our history, and the physical nature, there's the safety nature, and there's the human element. I mean, as you just described the story with Gino, I mean, and the animals with him, being on a lighthouse and stationed there, whether you're with another lighthouse keeper, I can only imagine what those relationships were like. A bunch of grumpy old men, maybe some women manning a lighthouse, but you also, I imagine, had the families on the lighthouse too. Wow.
Yes, absolutely. The families were expected by the Lighthouse Service. They were expected to help out. Occasionally, the wife was an assistant keeper, and there were a lot of women who served as keepers, which is unusual for the day that a woman would be given a job like this. But they weren't allowed to wear the uniform, so we call them keepers in skirts. But they were very capable, and right up until lighthouses became very technical and there was a lot of machinery and so forth, we saw a lot of women. After the machinery and the technology came in, it wasn't that the women couldn't do it. It's that the Lighthouse Service didn't think they could because of attitude of the day. Yeah, but the Coast Guard actually had two women who were lighthouse keepers too. And I met one of them and interviewed her and visited her at her lighthouse. And it looked like the absolute dream job to me. She was on the Kennebec River in Maine, and she had her kids there with her all day, and picturesque and nice, but a very serious person as well.
Yeah. I'm thinking I would love to have a week or so just on the lighthouse. I mean, all I need is a place to podcast, a good cup of coffee, and some scenery. And I'm a happy guy. I'm low maintenance, so I can only imagine how.
Well, if I got a deal for you, okay. I've got a deal for you. There are probably 25 lighthouses around the country where you can do just that. And my favorite is in Washington State, where I used to live. It's the new Dungeness Light Station in Sequim. It overlooks the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It's out on a spit about 5.5 miles out. You have to get out there in a all-terrain vehicle, and they have you bring your groceries, and you just stay for the week, and you do a few chores, and it's absolutely heaven.
Okay, so you and I are going to be talking about this, and I can, when I call them and say, hey, I have a connection. That's the beauty of this podcast, Elinor, is I get to make new friends and have connections. And, this is good stuff. I'm actually kind of just rubbing my hands saying,
Yes.
this is good. Listen, Elinor, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where's the best places for them to go?
Well, there are a couple of places online. I have a website. It's www.elinordewire.com. And then more popular, I think, is my blog. It's always on a topic about either writing and the writing life or lighthouses, which is really most of my writing life. And that is elinor.dewire@blogspot.com. And I'm always looking for comments and input. What do you want to know? What do you want to hear about? I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm on all the social media. And I have a good collection of books on Amazon as well.
Fantastic. And we are definitely going to provide links back to the website, all your social sites. I did register for your blog, so I'm going to be getting your blog. And some ideas are kind of popping off in the top of my head about some future podcasting with you. We're about ready to launch a kind of a group for some authors and to kind of help listen, talk to, ask questions of other successful authors. So I can certainly see your experience, your work with your writing on the lighthouses and just the kind of the whole human element. Would love to have you be our guest on that as well. But I'd be delighted. Yeah, this was just like so fascinating. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to join us on the Success Insight podcast.
Well, great. And thank you, Howard. And I get out of cooking tonight because we did this podcast. I love it. I'm being taken out to dinner.
Oh, well, good for you.
We planned this just right.
Thank you so much. This has been a true pleasure, and certainly looking forward to continuing to hear more about you and reading some more about you and your work, and definitely staying in touch. So thank you again.
You are so welcome, and I'm happy to come on anytime and talk about my passion.
Folks, this has been a wonderful podcast. So my memories of childhood are fully engaged, and just learning a lot about the history and about lighthouses and Elinor DeWire and her passion and how she's turned a kind of a chance encounter into a full-blown career. And, how cool is that? So definitely do visit her website, elinordewire.com. We'll provide links back to her blog. Sign up for her blog as well on the Blogspot site. And we'll provide the backlinks to Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and of course the Amazon page where there is an entire library of books around the subject of lighthouses. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast as well as I did, because this is why we do what we do. And if you enjoyed our podcast, especially today with Elinor, please comment on our website, www.successinsightpodcast.com. We're on Facebook, successinsightpodcast.com. We're on LinkedIn as well, YouTube. In fact, I think we're everywhere. So wherever you find us, please comment and let us know what you think. And if you've got some subjects and authors you think we ought to be interviewing, please let us know that as well. So our podcast has been sponsored by Fox Coaching Inc. and First Story Strategy. So, hey, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.